What is a Weltanschauung, a world conception, a philosophy? As we all know, Turgenev was a realist, and from the first he tried to portray life truthfully. Although we had had no precise exponents of realism, yet after Pushkin it was impossible for a Russian writer to depart too far from actuality. Even those who did not know what to do with real life had to cope with it as best they could. Hence, in order that the picture of life should not prove too depressing, the writer must provide himself in due season with a philosophy. This philosophy still plays the part of the magic wand in literature, enabling the author to turn anything he likes into anything else. Most of Turgenev's works are curious in respect of philosophy. But most curious is his Diary of a Superfluous Man. Turgenev was the first to introduce the term "a superfluous man" into Russian literature. Since then an endless amount has been written about superfluous people, although up till now nothing important has been added to what was already said 50 years ago. There are superfluous people, plenty of them. But what is to be done with them? No one knows. There remains only to invent philosophies on their behalf. In 1850, Turgenev, then a young man, thus solved the problem. He ends the diary with a humorous postscript, supposed to have been scribbled by an impertinent reader on the last flyleaf of the manuscript. This manuscript was read, and contents thereof disapproved, by Peter Zudotyeshin. Dear Sir, Peter Zudotyeshin, my dear sir. It is obvious Turgenev felt that after a tragedy must follow a farce, and therein lies the substance of his philosophy. It is also obvious that in this feeling he has the whole of European civilization behind him. Turgenev was the most educated, the most cultured of all Russian writers. He spent nearly all his life abroad, and absorbed into himself all that European learning could offer. He knew this, although he never directly admitted it, owing to an exaggerated modesty which sometimes irritates us by its obviousness. He believed profoundly that only learning, only European science could open men's eyes to life, and explain all that needed explanation. According to this belief he judges even Tolstoy. The saddest instance of the lack of real freedom, the 60-year-old Turgenev writes of War and Peace, in his literary memoirs. The saddest instance of the lack of real freedom, arising from the lack of real knowledge, is revealed to us in Leo Tolstoy's latest work, a work which at the same time, by virtue of its creative, poetic force, ranks almost first among all that has appeared in Russian literature since 1840. No, without culture, without freedom in the widest sense, freedom within oneself, freedom from preconceived ideas, freedom with regard to one's own nation and history, without this the real artist is unthinkable. Without this free air he cannot breathe. Listening to Turgenev, one might imagine that he had learned some great secret in the West, a secret which gave him the right to bear himself cheerfully and modestly when other people despaired and lost their heads. A year after the writing of the literary memoirs above quoted, Turgenev happened to be present at the execution of the notorious murderer Tropman. His impressions are superbly rendered in a long article called Tropman's Execution. The description produces a soul-shaking effect upon the reader, for I think I shall not exaggerate if I say that the essay is one of the best, at least one of the most vigorous, of Turgenev's writings. It is true that Tolstoy describes scenes of slaughter with no less vigor, and therefore the reader need not yield too much to the artist's power. Yet when Turgenev relates that at the decisive moment, when the executioners like spiders on a fly threw themselves on Tropman and bore him to the ground, the earth quietly swam away from under my feet, we are forced to believe him. Men respond only faintly to the horrors that take place around them, except at moments when the savage, crying incongruity and ghastliness of our condition suddenly reveals itself vivid before our eyes, and we are forced to know what we are. Then the ground slides away from under our feet. But not for long. The horror of the sensation of groundlessness quickly brings man to himself. He must forget everything. He must only get his feet on earth again. In this sense Turgenev proved himself in as risky a state at 60 as he was when, as a young man, he wrote his diary of a superfluous man. The description of Tropman's execution ends with these words: "Who can fail to feel that the question of capital punishment is one of the urgent, immediate problems which modern humanity must settle? I shall be satisfied if my story will provide even a few arguments for those who advocate the abolition, or at least the suppression of the publicity of capital punishments." Again the mountain has brought forth a mouse. After a tragedy, a farce. Philosophy enters into her power, and the earth returns under one's feet. I emphasize and repeat, Turgenev is not alone responsible for his attitude. With his lips speaks the whole of European civilization. On principle, all insoluble problems are rejected. During her 1,000 years of experience, the old civilization has acquired the skill which allows her children to derive satisfaction and benefit out of anything, even the blood of their neighbor. Even the greatest horrors, even crimes are beneficial, properly construed. Turgenev was, as we know, a soft, humane man, an undoubted idealist. In his youth he had been through the Hegelian school. And from Hegel he learned what an enormous value education has, and how supremely important it is for an educated man to have a complete and finished, most certainly a finished philosophy. 18. To praise oneself is considered improper, immodest. To praise one's own sect, one's own philosophy, is considered the highest duty. Even the best writers have taken at least as much trouble to glorify their philosophy as to found it, and have always had more success in the former case than in the latter. Their ideas, whether proven or not, are the dearest possession in life to them, in sorrow a consolation, in difficulty a source of counsel. Even death is not terrible to ideas. They will follow man beyond the grave. They are the only imperishable riches. All this the philosophers repeat, very eloquently repeat, and reiterate concerning their ideas, not less skilfully than advocates plead their cases on behalf of thieves and swindlers. But nobody has ever yet called a philosopher a hired conscience, though everybody gives the lawyer this nickname. Why this partiality? 19. Certain savage tribes believe that their kings need no food, neither to eat nor to drink. As a matter of fact, kings eat and drink, and even relish a good mouthful more than ordinary mortals. So, having no desire, even for the sake of form, to abstain too long, they not infrequently interrupt the long drawn out religious ceremonies of their tribes, in order to command refreshment for their frail bodies. But none must witness, or even be aware of this refreshing. And so, while he eats, the king is hidden within a purple pall. Metaphysicians remind one of these savage kings. They want every one to believe that empiricism, which means all reality and substantial existence, is nothing to them. They need only pure ideas for their existence. In order to keep up this fiction, they appear before the world invested in a purple veil of fine words. The crowd knows perfectly well that it is all a take-in, but since it likes shows and bright colours, and since also it has no ambition to appear too knowing, it rarely betrays that it has caught the trick of the comedy. On the contrary, it loves to pretend to be fooled, knowing by instinct that actors always do their best when the audience believes implicitly in what happens. Only inexperienced youths and children, unaware of the great importance of the conventional attitude, now and then cry out in indignation and give the lie to the performance, like the child in Andersen's story who so unexpectedly and inopportunely broke the general, deliberate illusion by calling out, "But the king is naked!" Of course everybody knows without telling that the king is naked, that the metaphysicians not only are unable to explain anything, but that hitherto they have not been able to present even a single hypothesis free from contradiction. It is necessary to pretend to believe that kings eat nothing, that philosophers have divined the secrets of the universe, that arbitrary theories are more precious than empirical harvests, and so on. There remains only one difficulty. Grown-ups may be won over to the conventional lie, but what about the children? With them the only remedy is the Pythagorean system of upbringing, so glorified by Hegel. Children must keep silent and not raise their voice until they realize that some things may not be talked about. This is our method. With us pupils remain silent, not only for 5 years, as the Pythagoreans recommended, but for 10 or more, until they have learned to speak like their masters. And then they are granted a freedom which is no longer any good to them. Perhaps they had wings, or might have had them, but they have crawled all their life long in imitation of their masters, so how can they now dream of flight? To a well-informed man who has studied much, the very thought of the possibility of tearing himself away from the earth, even for a moment, is horrifying, as if he knew beforehand what the result would be. 20. The best, the most effective way of convincing a reader is to begin one's argument with inoffensive, commonplace assertions. When suspicion has been sufficiently lulled, and a certainty has been begot that what follows will be a confirmation of the reader's own accepted views, then has the moment arrived to speak one's mind openly, but still in the same easy tone, as if there were no break in the flow of truisms. The logical connection is unimportant. Consequence of manner and intonation is much more impressive than consequence of ideas. The thing to do is to go on in the same suave tone, from uttering a series of banalities to expressing a new and dangerous thought without any break. If you succeed in this, the business is done. The reader will not forget. The new words will plague and torment him until he has accepted them. 21. The habit of logical thinking kills imagination. Man is convinced that the only way to truth is through logic, and that any departure from this way leads to error and absurdity. The nearer we approach the ultimate questions of existence in our departure from logicality, the more deadly becomes the state of error we fall into. The Ariadne ball has become all unwound long ago, and man is at the end of the tether. But he does not know, he holds the end of the thread firmly, and marks time with energy on the same spot, imagining his progress and little realizing the ridiculous situation into which he has fallen. How should he realize, considering the innumerable precautions he has taken to prevent himself from losing the logical way? He had better have stayed at home. Once he set out, once he decided to be a Theseus and kill the Minotaur, he should have given himself up, forfeited the old attachment, and been ready never to escape from the labyrinth. True, he would have risked losing Ariadne, and this is why long journeys should be undertaken only after family connections have become a burden. Such being the case, a man deliberately cuts the thread which binds him to hearth and home, so that he may have a legitimate excuse to his conscience for not going back. Philosophy must have nothing in common with logic. Philosophy is an art which aims at breaking the logical continuity of argument and bringing man out on the shoreless sea of imagination, the fantastic tides where everything is equally possible and impossible. Certainly it is difficult, given sedentary habits of life, to be a good philosopher. The fact that the fate of philosophy has ever lain in the hands of professors can only be explained by the reluctance of the envious gods to give omniscience to mortals. While stay-at-home persons are searching for truth, the apple will stay on the tree. The business must be undertaken by homeless adventurers, born nomads, to whom ubi bene ibi patria. It seems to me that but for his family and his domesticity, Count Tolstoy, who lives to such a ripe old age, might have told us a great many important and interesting things. Or perhaps, had he not married, like Nietzsche, he would have gone mad. If you turn to the right, you will marry. If to the left, you will be killed. A true philosopher never chooses the middle course. He needs no riches, he does not know what to do with money. But whether he turns to the right or to the left, nothing pleasant awaits him. Scratch a Russian and you will find a Tartar. Culture is an age-long development, and sudden grafting of it upon a race rarely succeeds. To us in Russia, civilization came suddenly whilst we were still savages. At once she took upon herself the responsibilities of a tamer of wild animals, first working with decoys and baits, and later, when she felt her power, with threats. We quickly submitted. In a short time we were swallowing in enormous doses those poisons which Europe had been gradually accustoming herself to, gradually assimilating through centuries. Thanks to which, the transplanting of civilization into Russia turns out to be no mild affair. A Russian had only to catch a whiff of European atmosphere, and his head began to swim. He interpreted in his own way, savage like, whatever he heard of Western success. Hearing about railways, agricultural machines, schools, municipalities, his imagination painted miracles. Universal happiness, boundless freedom, paradise, wings, etc. And the more impossible his dreams, the more eager he was to believe them real. How disillusioned with Europe the Westerner Herzen became after living for years on end abroad! Yet, with all his acuteness, it did not occur to him that Europe was not in the least to blame for his disillusionment. Europe had dropped miracles ages ago; she contented herself with ideals. It is we in Russia who will go on confusing miracles with ideals, as if the two were identical, whereas they have nothing to do with each other. As a matter of fact, just because Europe had ceased to believe in miracles, and realized that all human problems resolved down to mere arrangements here on earth, ideas and ideals had been invented. But the Russian bear crept out of his hole, and strolled to Europe for the elixir of life, the flying carpet, the 7-leagued shoes, and so on, thinking in all his naivete that railways and electricity were signs which clearly proved that the old nurse never told a lie in her fairy tales. All this happened just at the moment when Europe had finally made away with alchemy and astrology, and started on the positive researches resulting in chemistry and astronomy. The first assumption of all metaphysics is that by dialectic development of any concept a whole system can be evolved. Of course the initial concept, the a priori, is generally unsound, so there is no need to mention the deductions. But since it is very difficult in the realm of abstract thought to distinguish a lie from truth, metaphysical systems often have a very convincing appearance. The chief defect only appears incidentally, when the taste for dialectic play becomes blunted in man, as it did in Turgenev towards the end of his life, so that he realizes the uselessness of philosophical systems. It is related that a famous mathematician, after hearing a musical symphony to the end, inquired, "What does it prove?" Of course it proves nothing, except that the mathematician had no taste for music. And to him who has no taste for dialectics, metaphysics can prove nothing either. Therefore those who are interested in the success of metaphysics must always encourage the opinion that a taste for dialectics is a high distinction in a man, proving the loftiness of his soul. 24. Man is used to having convictions, so there we are. We can none of us do without our hangers-on, though we despise them at the bottom of our souls. 25. Socrates and Plato tried to determine under the shifting change of appearance the immutable, unchanging reality. In the Platonic Ideas the attempt was incarnated. The visible reality, never true to itself, assuming numberless varying forms, this is not the genuine reality. That which is real must be constant. Hence the ideas of objects are real, and the objects themselves are fictitious. Thus the root of the Platonic philosophy appears to be a fundamental defect in human reasoning, a defect regarded as the highest merit. It is difficult for the philosopher to get a good grasp of this agitated, capricious life, and so he decides that it is not life at all, but a figment. Dialectics is supreme only over general concepts, and the general concepts are promoted to an ideal. Since Plato and Socrates, only such philosophers have succeeded largely who have taught that the unchangeable is preferable to the changeable, the eternal to the temporal. The ordinary individual who lives unconsciously, never reckoning his spiritual credit against his spiritual debit, naturally regards the philosopher as his legitimate bookkeeper, keeper of the soul's accounts. Already in Greece the Athenian youth watched with passionate interest the dexterity which Socrates displayed in his endeavour to restore by means of dialectics the lost ultimate foundations of human conduct. Now in bookkeeping, as we are aware, not a single farthing must disappear untraceably. Socrates was trying to come up to expectations. The balance between man's spiritual assets and liabilities was with him ideally established. Perhaps in this lies the secret of that strange attraction he exerted even over such volatile and unsteady natures as that of Alcibiades, drawing the young men to him so that they were attached to him with all their soul. Alcibiades had long since lost all count of his spiritual estate, and therefore from time to time he had need to recourse to Socrates, who by speeches and dissertations could bring order into chaos and harmony into the spiritual confusion of his young friend. Alcibiades turned to Socrates to be relieved. Of course he sought relief in order that he might begin again his riotous living. Rest is so sweet to a tired man. But to conclude that because Alcibiades exhausted himself, and because rest is sweet, therefore all men must rest, this is absurd. Yet Socrates dictated this conclusion in all his ideas. He wished that all men should rest through eternity, that they should see their highest fulfilment in this resting. It is easier to judge of Socrates since we have Count Tolstoy with us. Probably the physiognomist Topir would say of Tolstoy as he said of Socrates, that there are many evil propensities lurking in him. Topir is not here to speak, but Tolstoy has told us himself how wicked he found his own nature, how he had to struggle with it. Tolstoy is not naturally over courageous. By long effort he has trained himself to be bold. How afraid of death he was in his youth, and how cleverly he could conceal that fear. Later on, in mature age, it was still the fear of death which inspired him to write his confession. He was conquering that fear, and with it all other fears. For he felt that, since fear is very difficult to master in oneself, man must be a much higher being when he has learned not to be afraid any more. Meanwhile, who knows? Perhaps cowardice, that miserable, despicable, much abused weakness of the underworld, is not such a vice after all. Perhaps it is even a virtue. Think of Dostoevsky and his heroes. Think of Hamlet. If the underworld man in us were afraid of nothing, if Hamlet were naturally a gladiator, then we should have neither tragic poetry nor philosophy. It is a platitude that fear of death has been the inspiration of philosophers. Numberless quotations could be drawn from ancient and modern writers, if they were necessary. Maybe the poetic daimon of Socrates, which made him wise, was only fear personified. Or perhaps it was his dark dreams. That which troubled him by day did not quit him by night. Even after the sentence of death, Socrates dreamed that he ought to engage in the arts. So, in order not to provoke the gods, he began to compose verses at the age of 70. Tolstoy also at the age of 50 began to perform good deeds, to which performance he had previously given not the slightest attention. If it were our custom nowadays to express ourselves mythologically, we should no doubt hear Tolstoy telling us about his daimon or his dreams. Instead, he squares his accounts with science and morality in place of gods or demons. Many a present-day Alcibiades, who laves all the week in the muddy waters of life, comes on Sundays to cleanse himself in the pure stream of Tolstoyan ideas. Bookkeeping is satisfied with this modest success, and assumes that if it commands universal attention one day in the week, then obviously it is the sum and essence of life, beyond which man needs nothing. On the same grounds, the keepers of public baths could argue that since so many people come to them on Saturdays, therefore cleanliness is the highest ambition of man, and during the week no one should stir at all, lest he sweat or soil himself. 26. In an old French writer, a contemporary of Pascal, I came across the following remarkable words. Note. What follows is a lengthy French quote, translation provided by the reader. End note. Man is so miserable that the inconstancy with which he abandons his plans is in some sense his greatest virtue, because it bears witness that he still has in him a remnant of grandeur that is the doorway into disgust of things that do not deserve his love and esteem. What a long way modern thought has travelled from even the possibility of such an assumption. To consider inconstancy the finest human virtue! Surely, in order to get somewhere in life, it is necessary to give the whole self, one's whole energy to the service of some one particular purpose. In order to be a virtuoso, a master of one's art and one's instrument, it is necessary with a truly angelic or asinine patience to try over and over again, dozens, hundreds, thousands of times, different ways of expressing one's ideas or moods, sparing neither labour, nor time, nor health. Everything else must take a second place. The first must be occupied by the art. Gontcharoff, in his novel Oblomov, cleverly relates how a cellist struggled all day like a fish against the ice, sawing and sawing away, so that later on in the evening he might play super excellently well. And that is the general idea. Objectionable, tedious, irritating labour, this is the condition of genius, which no doubt explains the reason why men so rarely achieve anything. Genius must submit to cultivate an ass within itself, the condition being so humiliating that man will seldom take up the job. The majority prefer talent, that medium which lies between genius and mediocrity. And many a time towards the end of life does the genius repent of his choice. It would be better not to startle the world, but to live at one with it, says Ibsen in his last drama. Genius is a wretched, blind maniac, whose eccentricities are condoned because of what is got from him. And still we all bow to persevering talent, to the only God in whom we moderns believe, and the eulogy of inconstancy will awake very little sympathy in our hearts. Probably we shall not even regard it seriously. 27. We very often express in a categorical form a judgment of which we do not feel assured. We even lay stress on its absolute validity. We want to see what opposition it will arouse, and this can be achieved only by stating our assumption not as a tentative suggestion which no one will consider, but as an irrefutable, all-important truth. The greater the value an assumption has for us, the more carefully do we conceal any suggestion of its improbability. 28. Literature deals with the most difficult and important problems of existence, and therefore littérateurs consider themselves the most important of people. A bank clerk, who is always handing money out, might just as well consider himself a millionaire. The high estimate placed upon unexplained, unsolved questions ought really to discredit writers in our eyes. And yet these literary men are so clever, so cunning at stating their own case and revealing the high importance of their mission, that in the long run they convince everybody, themselves most of all. This last event is surely owing to their own limited intelligence. The Roman augurs had subtler, more versatile minds. In order to deceive others they had no need to deceive themselves. In their own set they were not afraid to talk about their secrets, even to make fun of them, being fully confident that they could easily vindicate themselves before outsiders in case of necessity, and pull a solemn face befitting the occasion. But our writers of today, before they can lay their improbable assertions before the public, must inevitably try to be convinced in their own minds. Otherwise they cannot begin. 29. The writer is writing away, the reader is reading away. The writer doesn't care what the reader is after, the reader doesn't care what the writer is about. Such a state of things hurt Schedrin very much. He would have liked it different. No sooner has the writer said a word than the reader at once scales the wall. This was his ideal. But the reader is by no means so naive as all that. He prefers to rest easy, and insists that the writer shall climb the wall for him. So those authors succeed with the public who write with their heart's blood. Conventional tournaments, even the most brilliant, do not attract the masses any more than the connoisseurs. People rush to see a flight of gladiators where awaits them a scent of real hot smoking blood, where they are going to see real, not pretended victims. Thus many writers, like gladiators, shed their blood to gratify that modern Caesar, the mob. Salve Caesar! Morituri te salutant. 30. Anton Tchekhov tells the truth neither out of love nor respect for the truth, nor yet because in the Kantian manner a high duty bids him never to tell a lie, even to escape death. Neither has he the impulse which so often pushes young and fiery souls into rashness, that desire to stand erect to keep the head high. On the contrary, Tchekhov always walks with a stoop, his head bent down, never fixing his eyes on the heavens, since he will read no signs there. If he tells the truth, it is because the most reeking lie no longer intoxicates him, even though he swallow it not in the modest doses that idealism offers, but in immoderate quantities, 1,000-gallon barrel gulps. He would taste the bitterness, but it would not make his head turn as it does Schiller's, or Dostoevsky's, or even Socrates, whose head, as we know, could stand any quantity of wine, but went spinning with the most commonplace lie. 31. Noblesse oblige. The moment of obligation, compulsion, duty, that moment described by Kant as the essential, almost the only predicate of moral concepts, served chiefly to indicate that Kant was modest in himself and in his attitude towards all whom he addressed, perceiving in all men beings subject to the ennobling effect of morality. Noblesse oblige is a motto not for the aristocracy, which recognizes in its privileges its own instant duties, but for the self-made wealthy parvenus who pant for an illustrious title. They have been accustomed to telling lies, to playing poltroon, swindling and meanness, and the necessity for speaking the truth impartially, for bravely facing danger, for freely giving of their fortunes, scares them beyond measure. Therefore it is necessary that they should repeat it to themselves and to their children, in whose veins the lying, sneaking blood still runs hourly, lest they forget: you must not tell lies, you must be open, magnanimous. It is silly, it is incomprehensible, but noblesse oblige. 32. Homo homini lupus is one of the most steadfast maxims of eternal morality. In each of our neighbours we fear a wolf. This fellow is evil-minded. If he is not restrained by law, he will ruin us. So we think every time a man gets out of the rut of sanctified tradition. The fear is just. We are so poor, so weak, so easily ruined and destroyed. How can we help being afraid? And yet, behind danger and menace there is usually hidden something significant, which merits our close and sympathetic attention. But fear's eyes are big. We see danger, danger only. We build up a fabric of morality, inside which, as in a fortress, we sit out of danger all our lives. Only poets have undertaken to praise dangerous people, Don Juans, Fausts, Tannhäusers. But nobody takes the poets seriously. Common sense values a commercial traveller or a Don much more highly than a Byron, a Goethe, or a Molière. 33. The possibilities which open out before mankind are sufficiently limited. It is impossible to see everything, impossible to know everything, impossible to rise too high above the earth, impossible to penetrate too deeply down. What has been is hidden away, what will be we cannot anticipate, and we know for certain that we shall never grow wings. Regularity, immutably regular succession of phenomena, puts a term to our efforts, drives us into a regular, narrow, hard-beaten road of everyday life. But even on this road we may not wander from side to side. We must watch our feet, consider each step. Since the moment we are off our guard, disaster is upon us. Another life is conceivable, however, life in which the word disaster does not exist, where responsibility for one's actions, even if it be not completely abolished, at least has not such a deadly and accidental weight, and where, on the other hand, there is no regularity, but rather an infinite number of possibilities. In such a life the sense of fear, most disgraceful to us, disappears. There the virtues are not the same as ours. Fearlessness in face of danger, liberality, even lavishness are considered virtues with us, but they are respected without any grounds. Socrates was quite right when he argued that not all courage, but only the courage which measures beforehand the risks and the chances of victory, is fully justifiable. To the same extent those economical, careful people who condemn lavishness are in the right. Fearlessness and lavishness do not suit mortal men. Rather it becomes them to tremble and to count every penny, seeing what a state of poverty and impotence they exist in. That is why these two virtues are so rarely met with, and when they are met, why they arouse such superstitious reverence in the crowd. This man fears nothing and spares nothing. He is probably not a man, but a demigod, perhaps even a god. Socrates did not believe in gods, so he wanted to justify virtue by reason. Kant also did not believe in God, and therefore he derived his morals from law. But if there is a God, and all men are the children of God, then we should be afraid of nothing and spare nothing. And then the man who madly dissipates his own life and fortunes, and the lives and fortunes of others, is more right than the calculating philosophers who vainly seek to regulate mankind on earth. 34. Moral people are the most revengeful of mankind. They employ their morality as the best and most subtle weapon of vengeance. They are not satisfied with simply despising and condemning their neighbour themselves, they want the condemnation to be universal and supreme. That is, that all men should rise as one against the condemned, and that even the offender's own conscience shall be against him. Then only are they fully satisfied and reassured. Nothing on earth but morality could lead to such wonderful results.